All right. Well, hello, everybody. I hope you're having a really good day so far. I'm sure you're getting a lot of information, and they like to save the best, most exciting stuff for last. So here we are to talk about APA and academic writing. I know everybody's favorite topic. Usually not, and I'm well aware of that, but I am happy to be here with you today. I try to approach this topic because I know it's not often people's number one most exciting thing they're looking forward to in their graduate program. But it is something that I approach from, we're not all English professors. We don't all have to have that particular skill set. We just need to learn how to use this in order to survive and how we can help strengthen and grow our skills in the program, which will make your life easier, which will make your professors happier. And I'm all about reducing your stress and helping you survive this program with your sanity intact. So I'm glad to be here with you today. And what I'm going to do is go through some of the highlights of APA style writing. So kind of from a broad perspective, some things to do. We'll look at academic writing, particularly the type of scientific research writing that you'll be doing throughout your program, and give you some of my best advice about approaching that, what to do, what not to do. And we'll wrap it up with just some awareness of some of the free help that's available for you on campus with this process you'll be going through. So without further ado, we will jump on in to this topic. So APA style. How many of you have written in APA style before? Okay, see a hand. See a few head nods. Okay, you got that traumatized look if people have had to write in APA style before, and that's okay. Perfect. So not entirely brand new, but if you've been out of school for more than a couple of years or out of the academic writing game, the format, the edition may have changed since the last time you used APA. So this presentation is on the most recent style, which is the 7th edition of APA. It's been out for several years now. I think 2020 was when that was released. Lucky year, right, for all of us. So we're going on that version. And one of the differences with that 7th edition of APA is that it prescribes two different styles. One for student papers and one for papers that would be submitted for publication to an academic journal. So this presentation is going to focus on the student-facing version because that's what's going to be expected of you in most of your courses. And luckily, it's a little bit easier than the old format, which was kind of one size fits all. So you don't really have to wrestle with any of those running headers or things like that if you had to do that with the past edition of APA. So that's a good thing. So the student-facing version of APA in the 7th edition really just requires 4 different things. Sounds pretty simple, right? Title page, page numbers, the text or the body of your paper, and then a reference list. So just bare minimum requirements for the student-facing version, with the overall goal and intention of trying to keep this as simple as possible and not overcomplicate it for those class papers. I've got the example of the title page. There's not much change here from what you've probably saw in your previous programs as far as APA goes. The biggest change being that all you need as far as a running header or anything like that on your paper, it's a page number. And you can use Word's automatic page numbering feature with that number up there in the upper right-hand corner. So that's all you have to do for that. Pretty manageable. You've got your title, you've got your name, you've got your affiliation, your class, your instructor, the due date for the assignment. So pretty straightforward information there. The only thing I'll draw your attention to as far as the title page goes is you'll see that the title is now bolded on the title page of your paper. Previously, APA didn't do a lot of bolding, so that's different. You'll see there's 2 spaces in between the title and then your author information here at the bottom of the page. And all the text on this title page is in the top kind of third of your paper there. So you don't actually bring that all the way down to the middle. It stays kind of in the upper third or upper quarter of your paper there. So as we're going through this, feel free, we got a small enough group, you can unmute, you can go to the chat, and if you have any questions, feel free to stop me. We've got time if you want to talk about anything. So that's it for a title page, a lot more simple than it used to be. And from there, we will, here's a little bit bigger picture where you can kind of see the spacing differences there. The only space difference being between the title and that author affiliation, it being a little bit a double space there instead of just the regular double line spacing. So that's the title page. So once you get that title page out of the way, then you can work on formatting the body of your paper. And just like almost all papers you probably had to write in your academic career, this is going to be very similar. You will put the full title of your paper again on that first line of your paper. It is going to be bold, just like it was on the title page, centered, just like when you'd put the title on any other paper if it didn't have a cover page. So title again on that first paper. APA also says it's okay to use several different types of fonts. So that's a little bit different. You can see some of the ones that they prescribe there. They don't say you have to use just Times New Roman, although you can if you want. You'll see that Microsoft Word's default now, this Calibri, is on that list. The only thing to pay attention to about different types of font is that if you go with something beyond the standard, the size of that font changes a little bit because they're all different sizes. So Calibri, you'd use 11 point. If you use Arial, 11 point. Lucidia, which is a little bit bigger, you use a 10 point. Times New Roman is 12 point. So the old standard Times New Roman 12 point font, still good. So if that's what you use, you can continue to do that. But APA says it's okay to use other fonts as well. Then, as far as writing the actual words and your paragraphs into your paper, just like almost all styles, your text is going to be left aligned on that left side of your paper, and then it's going to be double spaced throughout. So the easiest way that I think to do double spacing for an APA style paper, I actually like to type all my paper single spaced and then go back and highlight the whole thing and then double space it. It's like a nice surprise at the end when you've almost met your page requirement there when before you only had a couple of pages. And there's a couple of reasons why I like to do it that way. So Microsoft Word, if a lot of you write your papers in Word, like most students do, it actually adds extra space into your paper. After you hit enter, it's going to add a little bit of extra space. It actually does space and a half. So I like to highlight my paper, then go and tell it to do double spacing. And then while I've got that line spacing option up, I'll go and tell it to remove extra space in between paragraphs, because I have seen nursing students get marked off for leaving that extra space in there. And I don't want you to lose points over a silly spacing issue. And that line spacing can be hard to remember to go back to if you don't do it at the same time. So just be aware of that extra spacing between anywhere you've hit enter, like a heading or starting a new paragraph, and that will take care of it. You can remove it in that line spacing option. So the next thing you're going to do is that each of your paragraphs is going to be indented, and you do that by pressing the tab key once. Don't be hitting that space bar a lot to make your indents. That makes it go a little bit wonky if you ever have to change things in it. So hitting the tab key is the easiest way to do that and indent all of your paragraphs uniformly. Then probably the most controversial change as far as formatting goes is that this version of APA tells you to only use one space after periods that end a sentence. I know a lot of us learned, back in typing class or computer class to period, space, space. And that was for typewriters. We're out of the age of typewriters. We don't have to do that anymore. I'm a double spacer after a period myself, so it's something I have to watch and try to make sure that I'm doing consistently. So only one space after periods that end a sentence. And if you are a diehard, period, space, space person, like I have tried to train myself out of, but I'm not entirely successful yet, there is an easy way to fix all that if you want to type your paper that way and change it at the end. So if you do a control find and go to like find and replace, you can tell Word to find period, space, space, and replace it with period space, and it will do that for you. You just have to take care that if you've abbreviated any initials or anything that don't have that space after it, that it won't mess those up. But one space after periods that end a sentence, and control find or find and replace can be your friend for helping with that kind of thing. So any questions about any of that formatting? So far, so good. All right. Another piece that we always get a lot of questions about here in the Writing Center. Oh, I'm so rude. I didn't introduce myself. Let me do that now. How about that? My name is Deidre Johnson. I am the director of the Center for Academic Achievement here at the university, and we kind of house the Writing Center, which helps with undergraduate students all the way up through students working on their thesis and dissertation. So we do a lot of writing support. I work with a lot of different programs about writing help within their area. I just came from a meeting today with the graduate program in computer science about writing for their students. So know a lot about writing, and really one of my favorite things to do is to help make that process more manageable for students. So that's why I know a little bit about the topic we're talking about today. Better late than never, right? So, body of your paper, headings. Headings are one of the pieces that we get a lot of questions about because students who are used to writing in other disciplines often don't use headings or haven't been allowed to use headings in their writing previously up to this point. But headings are a really handy tool. I like to think about it as if you were doing some research and pulling up some library articles on topics that you were interested in or related to maybe a paper you were writing. We typically don't sit down with that 35-page journal article and read it from page 1, paragraph 1, straight through all the way to the end, right? We tend to skim around and we tend to look for the section that we're most interested in. Maybe we're looking for papers that we're working with a specific population, or maybe we want to look for articles that use a particular research methodology. And we're not going to read that paper every word to find out that one question we have. So headings are a great way that help your reader kind of see what information is present in there to quickly jump to the area they're most interested in. And as a student, you can use headings to help your reader, which in most cases is going to be your professor, see that you have included all the different pieces of that assignment, of that paper that the professor has asked for. So it can be very helpful for you to take your assignment instructions that you get. If your professor tells you that you need to include a background section, a history section, an implication section, whatever sections or topics they tell you need, you can turn those into headings for your paper. And that's really helpful for a lot of reasons. I think about it as if you were working a puzzle. So you have this big puzzle you have to put together. You dump out a jigsaw puzzle. What's the first step you do to go about solving that puzzle?
Get the corners.
Now, Shannon goes and finds the corners. Then what would you do?
Flip all the pieces over?
Flip all the pieces over, see what I've got in place to put over. So I flip my pieces, I've got my corner pieces. Then where would you go from that?
Put like ones together.
Okay, like ones together, similar. I love it. Absolutely. So you're giving yourself some structure to kind of work within, whether that's grouping similar topics, whether that's identifying those corners, finding all those pieces with the straight edges so you can work your frame or your outline. Your headings can function exactly the same way for you as a writer. You can take those assignment instructions, you turn them into your corners, into your outline, your exterior piece. And then when you're writing, when you're flipping those pieces over, reading journal articles, all this information you're looking at, you can then really easily plug it into exactly the right section because you already made a pile of all the purple pieces, and that's going to go under this section and this heading. So it helps you keep your paper really organized. It also helps you make sure that you're sticking to those instructions that you were given, because a lot of times if people just read the instructions then go and start writing their paper, they might start in the right place, but oftentimes they end up out in left field or end up rambling. So this really keeps everything nice and tight and neat and organized. So headings are your friend as a graduate student for sure, because your papers get longer and more complex, and the better you can kind of detail your organization and structure, the easier it's going to be for you to write. And I really like that. If I'm staring at a blank Word document, just a blinking cursor, it's really hard for me to get going because I don't know where I'm going. I don't know what I'm doing. But if I can take 5 or 10 minutes to kind of lay all this out, I feel like I've accomplished something, and I feel like I have a clear direction to go in. I can just start in one section and start working there. So highly encourage you to use those headings as part of your writing process. And I've got the format for the headings here on the screen. This is pretty similar to headings the way that they've been in the past several editions here in APA style. The first level is centered, bold, and title case. So this is how you're going to treat the title of your paper, but also the titles of different sections of your paper, the big picture pieces. So that might be the abstract page if your professor asks for an abstract, or it might be your literature review chapter, as if that's something your professor has asked for. Those would be level 1 headings. And each level below this is going to be a smaller section of the level before it. So 2 is a piece of a 1, a 3 is a piece of a 2, and whenever we get to the next big piece, we go back to that level 1 heading. So levels 2 and 3, you'll see they are both flush left, bold title case. They get their own line on the paper. So you've got left bold title case. Then number 3 is italicized bold title case. So we got centered, left, then left, and italics. Then 4 and 5 are similar, except they're indented in. So levels 4 and 5 headings, it's not unheard of for people to get this far in student papers, but you'll almost certainly get to it in like your capstone or dissertation process as well. These actually are treated as the start to the sentence. So level 4 and 5 are like the beginning of a sentence. We write them just like any other heading. They're still bold, but we end it with a period, and then the actual wording of the sentence starts right after that. So they do not get their own line. They're on the same line as the actual writing of your paper. So those are the headings. I can't say my brain likes to store this information perfectly, but it's something that's pretty easy to look up if you forget how you're supposed to format a particular level there. Okay, well, let's talk about what most people think about when they see a format style. They think about citations and how am I going to cite my sources? And that's absolutely part of it. One of the good things about APA style is that it is surprisingly straightforward for how you cite information. They use what we call the author date format. So for most citations, all you need is the author's last name and then the year that that source was published. Now that varies a little bit depending on the type of source and the authors, but this table breaks it down pretty nicely. So if you've got a source that just has one author, we've got aversion to parenthetically cite that source. A parenthetical citation is a citation that comes at the end of a sentence in parentheses. That's what parenthetical stands for. The other column, the third column here, has narrative citation. So a narrative citation is where you can actually cite this source as part of the narrative or the narration in your sentences. So I'll give you an example. So the first one with one author, I might say, a study found that blood pressure was decreased by 20% on this medication. Then a parenthetical citation would then say Luna 2020, period. And the sentence would end with that citation there. In a narrative citation, I would instead say, a study conducted by Luna 2020 in parentheses found that this medication reduced blood pressure by 20%. So perfectly acceptable to cite that in either way because you got both of those key pieces of information, the author's name and the date of publication. So APA cares about those two things because they're concerned with who's conducting the research and the recency of that research. So we're looking for well-known, credible sources and recent citations for these topics because we want, cutting-edge health stuff. We don't want health advice from like 1962, right? We're looking for things on the cutting edge based on what we know now. Other format styles like maybe MLA, which is where a lot of people learn citation styles at first, is really based towards English and literature writing, where you are pulling a lot of direct quotes from sources, direct examples of things from actual written material. APA is more about paraphrasing. You actually rarely use quotes, but we'll talk about that on the next slide. So this is just for something that you have paraphrased for a piece of information that you're citing that's not exactly a direct quote. You can see we have two authors. So we've got Salas and D'Agostino, and we've got the parenthetical and the narrative citations there. One key difference that I'll draw your attention to for when you have multiple authors like this is that in the parenthetical citation, so inside of the parentheses with two authors, you're going to use the and symbol, that ampersand, in between the author's last names. If you are writing as part of the sentence the names of those authors, you will use the word and spell it out, just like you'd spell out all the other words in your sentences. So inside the parentheses, you use a symbol. Outside, you spell out the words. So just one of those little things that we see students sometimes get docked points for. We don't want that to happen to you. All right, then we've got 3 or more authors on the next line. This is also something that APA simplified in this edition. If you remember, it used to be one way for 2 to 3 authors and another way for 5 to 6 authors. Well, now they just say if you have 3 or more authors, all you need to do is include the lead author's last name, which is whichever author is listed first in that source. You should not alphabetize those authors' names. Whichever one is listed first is the lead author because those authors are listed in order of their contribution to the project. So if Martin is listed first, Martin probably did the most work out of this study. So don't change the order of the names. You should go with whichever one is listed first in the source. So use that author's last name, and then we use the Latin phrase et al. Et al is a phrase that kind of stands for and the rest of them. So Martin and the rest of the authors. You'll see that et al is not italicized. A lot of writing formats italicize foreign language phrases, but we don't treat this as one since it's part of the APA format. It's ET space AL period. So you'll see oftentimes people forget that period in between that comma in the parentheses there. So make sure you don't leave that period off. Et al, period, comma. Just get into the habit of that. Then if you include it as part of the sentence, you can just read it like Martin and the rest of them found this. So it's like a group author there. All right, then next is a type of source that you will probably use very frequently in your program, group authors. And the example that they've provided here is the National Institute for Mental Health, but there's a lot of group authors that people in the health science fields cite quite frequently. So you can see here, we've got this a little bit in two different versions, because if you have introduced this phrase previously in your paper, the first time you list out something that has an acronym like this, National Institute of Mental Health, you would typically put NIMH, or the abbreviation, there first as soon as you introduce that. So if I said this presentation is based on the 7th edition by the American Psychological Association, then I'd put APA in parentheses. So if you have already done that, then you don't have to list the entire author out again. You can just use, APA or NIMH as the abbreviation in every other place you mention that author throughout the rest of your paper. However, if you have not introduced that author verbally in the paper and actually spelled it out yet, you can do that in the first citation. Instead of doing parentheses, since we're already in parentheses, you would just use brackets around that abbreviation. And you only have to do that for the first time. Every time after that, you don't have to worry about it. And there's an example of how we could do that in the narrative as well. Sometimes we have group authors that don't have abbreviations, like Stanford University. We don't abbreviate that as SU. So that wouldn't make enough a sense for us to identify who that author is. So that one we'd want to spell all the way out and treat it just like we would a single author. But overall, in-text citations, you can do it inside the parentheses at the end of the sentence, or you could introduce it at the beginning of the sentence. It's a good idea to kind of switch it up and vary it around a little bit. Just strengthens your writing, it makes it more easier to read, and it avoids that repetition that comes from having something in there in exactly the same way all the time. Any questions about in-text citations so far? People never have any questions when they're not writing a paper, and that's okay. But feel free to interrupt if you do have any questions. Okay. On the last slide, I mentioned those in-text citations are for paraphrasing, and that is the majority of how you will present information within your papers, is by putting things into your own words and then citing the source from where that information came from. However, there is a way to cite direct quotes in APA style, because sometimes there will be things that you need to provide word for word, verbatim, the information directly from the source, and we don't want to change the words over there. But I do want to say, only use direct quotes when you actually need to do that. Some examples, might be if you're given a quote from Martin Luther King Jr., you don't want to change the words of that. If you are providing diagnostic criteria, for a particular disorder, we don't want to change that up too much and cause any confusion. Or maybe you're going to cite a section of the Affordable Health Care Act. That's also something we probably shouldn't change the wording of. It's pretty important to keep those specifically as they are written. So in that case, we would cite that as a direct quotation. And there's two different ways to do that depending on the length of your quotation. So if you have a short quote, which the APA defines as less than 40 words, all you have to do is add a page number to the typical way you would cite that in the body of your text. So Smith, 1999, page 9. That way, your reader can go directly to where that quote can be found in your source and go right to it if they want to. If you're working with a source that doesn't have a page number, because sometimes these don't, we find most of our information online now through databases, on websites. If that's the case and you don't have page numbers, you can just use whatever you do have to help direct people to that section. So that might be in section 6 or paragraph number 7, whatever's going to be the easiest way for your reader to find that. So page number if you have it for a direct quote. If you don't, then use a heading, section, or paragraph number, which you could abbreviate as paragraph 3, section 6, or the title of that actual section. So that's for short quotes. For those quotes, you would put that quotation in the quote marks to show that that's word for word, the same words as the source. But block quotes are a little bit different. So block quotes are a long quote that's going to be more than 40 words. And for block quotes, we actually break those out of the text of your paper and set them out on a new line. And we don't use quote marks because breaking it out shows this is word for word, the same as the source. So start it on a new line, and then the entire quote is going to be indented in. So you can tab over each line of that quote. You can cite that at the end of the quote. The exception there is it's going to come after the period. So usually that parenthetical citation goes inside of the period of your sentence. But for block quotes, we're putting it outside the period because we don't have quotation marks and we don't want them to think that that citation is part of the original quote. So it goes outside the period on a block quote. I think that looks a little bit awkward. So when possible, I try to do the citation in a narrative fashion and say, according to the Affordable Health Care Act, Section 6, and here's my quote from what came from the Affordable Health Care Act. So block quotes set out on their own. They look like a little block. They're indented in. Again, we don't use these very often, and I would encourage you to only use quotes when you need to, when you really don't want to change the wording of something around a little bit. Mostly you will be paraphrasing. All right. Tables and figures. So tables and figures are another piece that was definitely simplified in this updated version of APA style. Now APA only has one format for how you include tables and figures in your paper. They used to be different. So all that you have to do, and I've got some screenshots here. So you're going to order your tables and your figures in the order that they come in your paper. And you do number tables separately than figures. So you might have table 1, 2, and 3, and then you might have figures 1 through 10. Those numbers don't overlap. They are separate lists of numbers. You order them in the number that they appear in the paper. And then on the first line, you just put table 1, figure 1, and that's bold. Then you have your title below that in italics, same format for each. You have your table then, or your figure of information, and any notes that you might have about that figure or about that table go under the table there in italics. So not too bad. I know we don't typically include too much table or figure information here for most of our class papers, but you almost certainly will later on in your program when you are collecting your own data and reporting on information. So just know it's not that bad. The only place that I ever see students mess it up is sometimes putting wanting to put their notes up there under their title, which you don't have to do. It's at the bottom if you need it.
Question for you.
Yes.
Do we still keep that double spaced?
Yes. So the titles of the table, this is double spaced. The body of your actual table is typically not. There is some variation with spacing for tables. I typically see them spaced at about 1.5 because they get too crunched up at single spaced. But usually they're not the full double space because it creates so much blank space on the page in between that.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
No problem. APA doesn't prescribe a specific spacing for tables because usually that's going to be set forth by the publisher for whoever you're, trying to submit information to. You actually wrestle less with formatting for something that's going to be published because the journal will do that for you. And for here, the thesis and dissertation coordinator is actually going to go through things and format them according to the grad school format. But typically, I see most students do 1.5 spacing for the bodies of their tables. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good question. Great. Okay. Another more novel inclusion into the APA style is them specifying some guidelines for using inclusive and bias-free language. And this is something that's constantly evolving. Language changes all the time, but this is where we are at right now. And I think this does have some specific implications for the field of nursing, especially. So let me go through this and I'll tell you how this might come up for you. So their guidelines include suggesting for you to use appropriate specificity. For example, saying mankind or all of humankind is not as accurate or inclusive as saying just people in general. They want you to use person first language. And the easiest way to do that is to make sure that you are literally putting the person first. So instead of saying a blonde man, we would say a person or a man who is blonde. Instead of saying the poor, we would say people whose income is below the poverty level. So that way we're being really specific about exactly what we mean, by poor or low income. And we are definitely not identifying people by a descriptor of who they might be. So person first language. The next one is to avoid false hierarchies. And the way that I typically see this come up in student writing is they will say normal people or normal families or typical families or the average person. And we know that no person is the average person, right? Averages are made up of a lot of infinite little parts. That's not exactly how an average works. And we don't like to use the word normal because that implies that any differences are abnormal, can kind of stigmatize people or set them apart from society. So take care about using the term normal or even average or typical and those kind of things, because usually they're not as accurate as we would like them to be, and we could probably be a little bit more specific about exactly what we're talking about. So instead of saying something like a normal family has a mother, a father, and 2 children, we could say 65% of families have both a mother and father present within the home. So we could be a little more specific in what we're stating there. APA is also really big on reducing bias against particular groups or populations. And this one does come up in the field of nursing quite frequently. If we're talking about working with children or working with an older population of people, this is something I learned most recently from APA style, is that you're not supposed to say elderly anymore. Instead, you're supposed to very clearly and specifically define which group you're talking about. I'm talking about adults age 60 to 70, or adults 75 to 85, or adults older than 85, instead of using those more general terms. So just take care. We all know that it's not probably anyone's intention to be offensive by using a particular phrase that was perfectly fine to use 5 years ago. We're just doing better now than we were 5 years ago. So if you're ever unsure how you're supposed to refer to a group, the APA does have a list. I've got the page numbers there in the manual for how they refer you or prefer for you to refer to specific populations. So take a look in that. And you'll see most likely when you're doing your research, depending on when that research was published, the terms may change over time. And it might be something that when you're looking for your search terms, you've got to know exactly which terms you should be using. So if you're looking at a particular group or population, check that handbook for exactly which ones you're supposed to be looking for. Also, APA now endorses the use of the singular they instead of saying he or she, he or she, he or she. Patient A did this, he or she, did that. It avoids a lot of that awkwardness when we don't know an individual's preferred pronoun or don't know what gender or sex a person is or prefers to be referred to as. So you could say the patient did this instead of saying he or she did that. You could say they did this, even though it's singular and just one person. So that's perfectly acceptable now. And I'm just glad I don't have to type he/she anymore. So makes that a little more straightforward for you. You also want to take care, as far as this inclusive and bias-free language goes, to avoid making any binary gender assumptions. So in front of a classroom of students, you wouldn't say the boys and girls in the classroom, because that's binary, only two. You just say the children in the classroom. Instead of this he/she, which assumes two, we're going to say they instead. So just a few little tweaks and changes. And I'm sure in 5 more years, we'll have other new additions and new changes as the language kind of changes and reflects society as a whole. So just some tips and tricks there. All right, we're making it on to the end of the paper, the reference list. Not a whole lot has changed on how you format a reference list in APA style, except references is now bold at the top, still alphabetizing the entries on the reference list by the first name or the first word in that entry. You still do a hanging indent in APA style. And just like you're going to hit tab to indent in the beginning of your paragraphs, the easiest way to put a hanging indent on your reference list is to get your reference entry all typed in with all the pieces. And then when you go to that second line that you need to scoot in, hit Control Tab. That is a hanging indent, a good way to stick that. And I'll show you what it looks like on the next page. But the main change in this edition of APA style is that now all web addresses and DOI numbers, as digital object identifiers, will be linked. So with most things happening on the computer nowadays, they want people to be able to click right on that so they can go right to that source. And I'll show you some examples of this on the next slide. So we've got our references page here, still numbered. It's the end of our paper. You can see these are all alphabetized. And this is the hanging indent where the second line or third of each source is scooted in. This entire reference list is double spaced with any of that extra spacing taken away. And then you can just use Control Tab to scoot each of those lines in. You'll also see that some of this is blue now. We have those links in to websites. We have links into the DOI, digital object identifier numbers. Most recent APA sources now have that number that you can just link. And that's just a stable number that will always take you to that source. Whereas we know websites change all the time. This is something that's just a little bit more consistent. So you do actually have those live links within the body of your paper. We've got some examples here of books, a report, a journal article. Typically for most APA sources, you've got author year, just like your in-text citations. You typically have the title of that work next, then followed by the bigger container like the journal name, the name of the publication company for the book. If you do a government report, you might indicate which agency that came from. There's so many different types of sources that it probably wouldn't be a good use of our time to go through how to cite each one of those individually. It's all out there on the internet. You don't even have to have the handbook anymore because everything's online. And I do have some resources linked for you at the end of this presentation as well. So I will keep moving to keep us on time. So I'm thinking about big picture things for academic writing. I know a lot of us don't love writing, and it often feels like a job and like work and not a fun part, especially in a people-facing career like nursing can be. But it is really important, like I said, both for your sanity and your instructor's sanity, because whether we like it or not, people make assumptions about us based on written work. Just like when we turn in a resume or a cover letter for a type of position or have to write an admissions essay, like we're getting judged on our writing and what we communicate. And the better we can improve our writing skills, the better we'll be able to communicate important information no matter what the context is. So as I'm not a writing instructor, I'm not an English person. I actually come from a psychology and education background, but I do agree that writing is really important. So I do have some suggestions on the slide, and these came from working with some of the graduate nursing professors, their main complaints about what students do wrong in their writing. And it is that they don't have a clear thesis. They don't make a clear argument. They don't have good supporting points under that. They're not using quality sources to kind of support those claims they make. Bad organization, the formatting, the APA formatting. I will tell you, after working with numerous departments across campus, almost all of them, that the College of Nursing is the most particular and specific about getting your writing formatting correct. And that's with intention and with reason. It's not that they're a bunch of picky people. It is that details matter in nursing. And this is just another way to help you sharpen those details. Because we know errors can kill people, and maybe not with APA writing, but this is a way to practice that detail orientation that will, help people in the field. So yes, they are very, very particular about it, and there's a good reason why. And then also improving how clear and concise and academic, your writing is. But that's something you can work on and hone during graduate school for sure. Some big picture advice is that if you're doing good academic scientific writing, and you're going to see a trend here, they're always going to give a number and a percent. They're not going to make generalizations, not generalizations about groups of people or general statements. They're going to be really specific because we're kind of next level, top tier writing here. And we're also going to provide a context for the numbers. I'm sure it drives you all crazy when you see numbers misrepresented. For example, if 25 subjects had a reaction, oh, that sounds terrible. Yeah, maybe if your sample size was 30, but if it was 200,000 or 2 million, that's probably not an actual significant reaction. There could be any cause. We also want to stay away from using those general statements like a lot of research or many research or most researchers. Always give a number. Same thing, we're not going to say research says, the data says. We can say that, but we have to back it up with some specific support and citations for that. You also want to be careful about making too strong claims, because we know there's always an exception. We don't say always and we don't say never because those are always wrong and never true. So stay away from those two phrases and qualify what you're stating based on your sources. And don't forget, while the APA has guidelines for papers, always do what your instructor tells you, because your instructor is going to grade your paper, not APA. Definitely allow your instructors instructions to supersede the APA format, because some people want things just a little bit differently than that. And I will end this by telling you that the best thing you can do as a graduate student is to proofread your paper, and even better yet, let somebody else help proofread your paper. We have a huge graduate student population that use the center, where you can have free writing consultations. We have more than half a dozen postgraduate people who work with graduate students on their writing in a lot of different disciplines. And These sessions are great just to have somebody to bounce your ideas around with, to say, well, does this make sense, or is this coming across? I often see the graduate students making a lot more changes to their paper than the tutors do, but it's just a great conversation, and it's going to help strengthen your writing skills, help you learn some of those grammar rules you might have known once upon a time, or maybe not. It's going to make you a better writer, and it's also going to help you think a lot more critically and communicate a lot more clearly when you have someone else reading that paper all before your professor even sees it. So that's something that's completely free to you as ETSU students. The center is open 7 days a week during the fall and spring. We're open 4 days a week during the summer semesters. But we always have graduate writing tutors on deck who can help you either here on campus or via Zoom. So that's definitely an option if you are not local. And students really appreciate, that opportunity to kind of talk through their writing that you really can't get anywhere else. So check out our website if that's something that you're interested in doing. Most students find it incredibly helpful. And I've also got a lot of sources linked here that I'll pass this back to Bernita to share out with everybody at the end of the session.